The sweet scent of roses filled the air as Mrs. Thompson carefully trimmed her prized garden on a sun-drenched Sunday afternoon. At 73, her movements were slower than they used to be, but her love for gardening remained as strong as ever. She hummed an old gospel tune, one her grandmother had taught her decades ago, while gently cutting away dead leaves from her beautiful pink roses. Her small brick house, with its neat white trim and well-kept lawn, stood as a testament to 43 years of memories. It was the home where she had raised her children, welcomed grandchildren, and hosted countless Sunday dinners for her family. Every corner of the property reflected her careful attention, from the hand-painted mailbox to the cheerful window boxes overflowing with red geraniums. The peaceful rhythm of her afternoon was suddenly broken by the sharp sound of car engines. 2 police cruisers pulled up abruptly in front of her house, their tires crunching on the asphalt. Mrs. Thompson straightened up slowly, her arthritic hands still holding her gardening shears, as she watched the vehicles come to a stop. The quiet afternoon air, which moments ago had been filled only with birdsong and the distant laughter of children playing, now crackled with tension. Through her reading glasses, she could see neighbors beginning to peek out their windows. The Hendersons across the street had stopped washing their car, and old Mr. Parker next door had paused his newspaper reading to watch the scene unfold. Mrs. Thompson felt her heart begin to race, but years of experience as a schoolteacher had taught her to maintain her composure in difficult situations. The police officers emerged from their vehicles with an urgency that seemed out of place on this peaceful street. Their hands hovered near their weapons as they approached, a detail that didn't escape Mrs. Thompson's notice. She had lived through enough decades to recognize when a situation might turn dangerous, but she never imagined she would face such a moment while tending to her roses in her own front yard. "Ma'am, we've received reports of suspicious activity in this area," the first officer announced, his voice carrying across the yard. His younger partner flanked him, scanning the property as if searching for threats. Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but notice how they positioned themselves, one slightly to her left, the other to her right, using tactics she had seen too many times on the evening news. "Officers," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I live here. This has been my home for over 40 years. She gestured toward her house with her gardening shears, then immediately regretted the movement as both officers tensed visibly. Carefully, very carefully, she placed the shears on her gardening bench, her movements deliberate and slow. The spring breeze carried the scent of her roses across the yard, a jarring contrast to the tense situation unfolding. Mrs. Thompson thought of all the times she had welcomed new neighbors with bouquets cut from these very bushes. How many mornings had she spent out here, waving to passers-by, exchanging pleasantries with joggers and dog walkers? This was her sanctuary, her little piece of paradise, and now it felt like it was being invaded. "We'll need to see some identification," the younger officer demanded, his hand still resting near his weapon. Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, her mind racing ahead to her purse inside the house, wondering how these officers would react to her moving toward her front door. She had seen too many news stories, heard too many tragic tales that started just like this. The weight of her years seemed to press down on her shoulders as she stood there in her garden. She was no longer just a grandmother tending her roses. She was facing a moment that would require all the wisdom and patience she had accumulated over 7 decades of navigating a world that didn't always see her clearly. Just then, she heard another car approaching, and a familiar engine sound made her close her eyes in silent gratitude. Her son, who never missed their weekly Sunday dinner, was about to arrive. Despite her situation, a small smile crossed her face. Sometimes, timing was everything, and her boy had always known exactly when she needed him most. The younger officer's radio crackled with static as Mrs. Thompson stood in her garden, her hands now empty of the gardening tools she loved so much. The afternoon sun beat down on her back, and she could feel beads of sweat forming under her favorite flowered headscarf. Not from the heat. No, this was the kind of sweat that comes from knowing one wrong move could change everything. "Ma'am, how long did you say you've been here?" the older officer asked, his tone suggesting he didn't believe her earlier answer. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, drawing on the patience she'd developed during her 30 years of teaching 4th graders. "Since 1980, she replied calmly. "I bought this house when my late husband and I were both teaching at Pine Grove Elementary." The younger officer circled toward her prized rose bushes, his boots coming dangerously close to crushing her newly planted seedlings. Mrs. Thompson felt her heart skip. Those weren't just plants to her, they were living memories. Each rose bush had its own story. The yellow ones from her retirement party, the red ones her grandchildren helped plant, the pink ones her church friends gave her after her husband passed. "We've had reports of someone suspicious in the area," the older officer repeated, as if she hadn't heard him the first time. "Several expensive homes in this neighborhood have been broken into recently." His emphasis on expensive didn't escape her notice, nor did the implication that she somehow didn't belong in her own community. A small crowd had begun to gather now. Mrs. Thompson could see her neighbors trying to be subtle about their concern. The young couple who had moved in last spring stood on their porch, phones in hand. The retired postal worker who walked his dog past her house every afternoon had stopped at the corner, his German shepherd sitting alertly by his side. "My ID is in my purse, inside the house," Mrs. Thompson explained, gesturing toward her front door. The screen door was still open, and through it, she could see the family photos lining her hallway wall, 4 generations of her family smiling back at her. "I can go get it for you." "Stay where you are," the younger officer commanded, moving to block her path to her own front door. His hand was still resting on his weapon, and Mrs. Thompson felt her legs growing tired from standing so long. Her arthritis was acting up, but she knew better than to make any sudden moves to find a place to sit. The older officer spoke into his radio, requesting backup. The words "possible suspect" crackled through the air, making Mrs. Thompson's shoulders sag. In all her years, through civil rights movements, through decades of teaching, through raising her children to be proud and dignified, she had never felt quite so small in her own space. She thought about her son, who would be arriving any minute for their weekly dinner. Every Sunday, without fail, he'd come bearing fresh bread from the bakery downtown and stories about his work at the law firm. Today, she had prepared his favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, just like her mother used to make. The thought of the meal staying warm in her oven somehow made this situation even more surreal. Mrs. Thompson's fingers absently found the gold wedding band she still wore. Her husband would have known exactly what to do in this situation. He had always been the calm one, the one who could diffuse any tension with a well-timed word or gesture. "Keep your dignity," he used to tell their children. "It's the one thing they can't take from you unless you let them." The sound of another police car approaching made her heart sink further. Through the corner of her eye, she could see her roses swaying gently in the breeze, their peaceful dance a stark contrast to the scene unfolding in her front yard. The afternoon light was starting to soften, casting long shadows across her carefully tended lawn, and she wondered how much longer this ordeal would last. Just then, she'd heard a familiar car engine turning onto her street. A sound she had come to associate with Sunday dinners and family warmth was about to transform this tense standoff. Her son's timing had always been impeccable, a trait that had served him well in his legal career. As his car appeared at the end of the street, Mrs. Thompson stood a little straighter, knowing that sometimes justice arrives exactly when it's needed most. The backup officer's arrival brought a new wave of tension to Mrs. Thompson's normally peaceful front yard. Her legs were really starting to ache now. Standing in one place for so long was taking its toll on her joints. The pot roast in her oven, which should have been the centerpiece of a peaceful Sunday dinner, was probably starting to dry out. Such a small concern, yet it somehow made this whole situation feel even more wrong. "Listen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in a classroom. "I have my driver's license, my property deed, and plenty of family photos right inside. If you just allow me to," she gestured toward her front door again, but the younger officer cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Ma'am, we've had multiple reports of an elderly person being used as a front for criminal activity in this area," the backup officer announced, joining his colleagues. Mrs. Thompson noticed how he spoke about her as if she wasn't even there, as if her 43 years in this house meant nothing. She thought about all the neighborhood children she had tutored at her kitchen table, the countless PTA meetings she had hosted in her living room, the community garden she had helped start just 2 blocks away. The neighbors were getting bolder now. Mrs. Chen from 3 doors down had walked over to stand at the edge of the property, her phone clearly recording everything. The young couple who had brought Mrs. Thompson soup when she had the flu last winter were whispering urgently into their phones. Even old Mr. Parker, who rarely left his porch these days, had made his way to his front yard. "I don't understand," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice steady despite her growing frustration. "How exactly am I supposed to prove this is my home if you won't let me get my identification?" Her arthritis was flaring up something fierce now, and she desperately wanted to sit down on her porch swing, the same swing where she read stories to her grandchildren every Wednesday afternoon. The oldest officer stepped closer, his badge catching the late afternoon sun. "Step away from the house, ma'am," he ordered, as if she was some kind of threat. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. Her, a grandmother who needed help opening tight jar lids, who spent her mornings doing gentle yoga for seniors, who baked cookies for the local fire station every Christmas. A warm breeze rustled through her rose garden, carrying the sweet scent that usually brought her so much peace. But now that same breeze also carried the murmurs of her gathering neighbors, the static of police radios, and the distant sound of more sirens. Mrs. Thompson felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had not spent 7 decades building a life of dignity to have it crumble in her own front yard. She could hear more neighbors emerging from their homes now. The Williams family from across the street, who always helped her bring in her groceries. The retired nurse who walked her poodle past the house every evening. The young college student who mowed her lawn in exchange for math tutoring. All of them watching, all of them witnesses to this inexplicable scene. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across her carefully maintained flower beds. Mrs. Thompson thought about all the Sunday evenings she had spent on her porch, watching similar sunsets with her family. How many times had she sat there, sharing stories and laughter with loved ones? Now here she stood, being treated like an intruder in the space she had called home for nearly half a century. Just as the situation seemed to be reaching a breaking point, with the officers growing more stern and the neighbors more restless, Mrs. Thompson heard the distinct sound of her son's car turning onto their street. The familiar purr of his engine was like music to her ears. Her son, with his law degree and his quiet strength, was about to turn this situation on its head. As his car approached, Mrs. Thompson felt a mix of relief and sadness, relief that help was coming, but sadness that such help was needed at all. She stood as straight as her tired bones would allow, holding on to her dignity like armor. Sometimes, she thought, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be broken by those who fail to see your humanity. The familiar black sedan turned onto the street with practiced ease, its polished surface reflecting the late afternoon sun. Mrs. Thompson's son had made this drive every Sunday for the past 15 years, ever since he opened his own law practice downtown. Today, though, he wasn't arriving to the usual scene of his mother waiting on the porch with her warm smile. Instead, he found his childhood home surrounded by police cruisers, their lights casting uncomfortable shadows across his mother's beloved rose garden. He took in the scene with the calculated calm that had won him numerous cases in the courtroom. Through his windshield, he could see his mother standing in the yard, her gardening apron still tied around her waist, surrounded by officers whose hands hovered too close to their weapons. The sight made his blood run cold, but years of legal experience had taught him that emotion needed to be channeled into action. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed how the officers' attention split, some staying focused on his mother, others turning toward his car. He could read the situation like a legal brief. The tension in their shoulders, the way they had positioned themselves around his mother, the gathering of neighbors who knew something was deeply wrong with this picture. He turned off his engine and took a deep breath, remembering all the lessons his parents had taught him about handling difficult situations. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "It's not just what you do, son, it's how you do it." His mother had reinforced those lessons through example, shown him how dignity and determination could move mountains. Reaching for his briefcase in the passenger seat, he could smell his mother's pot roast, the Sunday dinner tradition that had brought him here right when she needed him most. The scent mixed with the fragrance of her roses, creating a surreal contrast to the tense scene before him. He adjusted his tie, a habit from countless courtroom appearances, and opened his car door with deliberate slowness. The officers watched his every move as he stepped out of his car. He stood to his full height, his tailored suit and confident bearing marking him as someone who understood the law intimately. He held his leather briefcase in one hand, the same briefcase his mother had given him when he passed the bar exam, the gold initials on its surface catching the sunlight. "Good evening, officers," he called out, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in court. "I'm a civil rights attorney, and that woman you're surrounding is my mother." He pulled out his phone with his free hand, already beginning to document the scene. The change in the officer's demeanor was subtle but immediate, the slight straightening of backs, the almost imperceptible shifting of weight. Mrs. Thompson watched her son approach, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in the strong, capable man he had become, sadness that his expertise in handling situations like this was necessary at all. She saw in him echoes of his father, the same steady walk, the same quiet strength, the same unwavering determination to stand up for what was right. The youngest officer spoke first. "Sir, we're responding to reports of suspicious activity." But his son cut him off with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. "I'm going to stop you right there, officer. I'd like your name, badge number, and the specific probable cause for detaining an elderly woman in her own front yard." His voice remained professional but carried a steel edge that came from years of fighting similar battles in courtrooms. The neighbors who had gathered seemed to collectively lean forward, sensing the shift in power. Mrs. Thompson's son moved closer to his mother, positioning himself slightly in front of her, a gesture of protection he had learned from his father long ago. He kept his phone steady, recording everything while simultaneously reaching into his briefcase for a business card. "I've been having Sunday dinner with my mother at this address for 15 years, he continued, his words measured and clear. "She's owned this home since I was in elementary school. Now, would someone like to explain why she's being treated like a criminal in her own front yard?" The late afternoon sun caught his mother's silver hair like a halo, and he felt a fierce surge of protection, the same feeling that had driven him to become a civil rights attorney in the first place. The tension in the air began to shift, like a weather vane turning to show new winds. His mother still stood straight and dignified despite her tired legs, and he knew that this moment, this intersection of family, justice, and dignity, would fuel his fight for civil rights even more. Sometimes the most powerful cases weren't the ones you found. They were the ones that found you. The entire atmosphere of the front yard shifted as Mrs. Thompson's son took control of the situation. His phone continued recording steadily in one hand while he reached into his briefcase with the other, pulling out a small notebook. The evening light caught his gold cufflinks, a gift from his mother on his first day as a partner at his law firm, as he began writing down badge numbers and names. "Officer," he addressed the senior policeman, his voice carrying the weight of countless courtroom victories, "I'm sure you're aware that detaining someone on their own property without probable cause is a violation of the Fourth Amendment." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'd also like to point out that every neighbor here has been recording this incident." The gathered crowd had grown larger, and Mrs. Thompson could see phones raised all around her yard. Even old Mr. Parker, who usually complained about those young people always on their phones, had his tablet out and recording. The young couple from down the street had gone live on social media, their whispered commentary carrying across the early evening air. Mrs. Thompson watched her son work, his movements precise and purposeful. He had learned to channel his anger into action, to transform outrage into results. She remembered how, as a child, he would get upset at injustice in any form, even arguing with his teachers when they treated other students unfairly. Now here he was, using that same sense of justice to protect her. "My mother has lived here for 43 years, he continued, his voice clear and steady. "She's a retired school teacher who's probably taught half the children in this neighborhood." He gestured to the crowd, where several adults nodded in recognition. Yet instead of verifying her identity by simply allowing her to retrieve her ID, you've chosen to escalate this situation unnecessarily. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado diminishing under the weight of professional scrutiny. The backup officer had already stepped back, suddenly very interested in his notepad. Even the senior officer's stance had changed, his hand no longer hovering near his weapon. "I'm going to be filing a formal complaint about this incident," Mrs. Thompson's son announced, pulling out his business cards and handing them to each officer. "But first, I'd like to speak with your supervising officer. I assume someone has already called them." The slight flinch from the youngest officer answered his question before any words could be spoken. Mrs. Thompson felt her legs trembling from standing so long, and her son noticed immediately. Without breaking his professional demeanor, he retrieved the cushioned chair from her porch, the one she used for reading on warm evenings. The simple act of him caring for her comfort while handling the situation spoke volumes to everyone watching. "Mother, please sit down," he said softly, before turning back to the officers with a harder edge in his voice. "I trust there's no objection to my mother resting in her own yard." The question wasn't really a question at all, and everyone knew it. The officers stepped back further, their earlier confidence replaced by growing uncertainty. The neighbors had drawn closer now, forming a protective semicircle around Mrs. Thompson's property. The retired nurse, who lived next door, brought over a glass of water, shooting a disapproving look at the officers as she passed. The young college student who mowed Mrs. Thompson's lawn stood with his arms crossed, his usually cheerful face set in a serious expression. A police supervisor's car pulled up to the scene, its arrival marking another shift in the situation. Mrs. Thompson's son straightened his tie, a habitual gesture before any important confrontation. He had prepared for moments like this throughout his career, but having his mother involved made everything different. This wasn't just another case. This was personal. "While we wait," he addressed the officers, "I'd like to remind you that racial profiling is not only unethical but illegal. My mother was gardening in her own yard when you arrived. I'd very much like to hear your explanation for how that constituted suspicious activity." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of decades of similar incidents, of battles fought and yet still needing to be fought. Mrs. Thompson sipped her water and watched her son, seeing in him both the boy she had raised and the man he had become. The pot roast in her oven would be overdone by now, their Sunday dinner tradition disrupted. But as she watched him standing there, protecting not just her but the principles she had taught him, she knew that some lessons were worth more than any meal. The police supervisor stepped out of her car, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. She noticed the elderly woman sitting in a garden chair, the well-dressed man standing protectively beside her, and the crowd of neighbors holding up their phones. The beautiful rose garden and well-maintained house told one story. The tense stance of her officers told another. "Good evening," Mrs. Thompson's son said, extending his business card to the supervisor. "I assume you've been briefed on the situation." The supervisor's eyes widened slightly as she read the card, recognizing the name of his law firm. She had seen him in court before, though they had never directly crossed paths. His reputation for handling civil rights cases preceded him. "I have 3 separate recordings of this entire incident," he continued, his voice carrying across the yard. "I also have about 24 witnesses who can testify to my mother being harassed while gardening in her own yard." He gestured to the neighbors, who nodded in agreement. The young couple who had been live-streaming gave a thumbs up, indicating they had captured everything. Mrs. Thompson watched as her son laid out the facts of the situation, his words measured but firm. He had learned this careful balance from her. She had always taught him that true strength came from staying calm under pressure. Now, sitting in her garden chair with the evening breeze carrying the scent of her roses, she felt a deep pride mixing with her exhaustion. The supervisor turned to her officers, her expression stern. "I want each of you to write detailed reports about what led to this situation," she ordered. "And I mean detailed." The younger officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. The senior officer stayed at his shoes, perhaps remembering similar incidents that had led to departmental investigations. "My mother has lived in this house since 1980, Mrs. Thompson's son continued. She's a retired educator who has contributed to this community for decades. The fact that she was treated this way in her own yard raises serious questions about your department's training and policies." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Questions that I intend to pursue thoroughly." The neighbors murmured in agreement. The retired nurse who had brought water earlier spoke up. "She taught my children, you know. Both of them are doctors now, thanks to her encouragement." Others joined in, sharing similar stories, how Mrs. Thompson had tutored their kids, organized community events, always been there to help a neighbor in need. The supervisor listened to these testimonials, her expression growing more concerned with each story. She turned to Mrs. Thompson, her voice softening. "Ma'am, I want to personally apologize for this incident. This is not how we want our officers to interact with any member of our community, especially not someone who has given so much to it." Mrs. Thompson nodded gracefully, her dignity undiminished by the ordeal. Her son placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a gesture of support that spoke volumes about their relationship. "I appreciate the apology," he said, "but we'll need more than words. I'll be filing a formal complaint first thing tomorrow morning, and I expect full cooperation with the investigation." The evening light had softened to purple and gold, casting long shadows across Mrs. Thompson's lawn. Her roses swayed gently in the breeze, their peaceful motion a stark contrast to the tension still lingering in the air. The pot roast in her oven had surely dried out by now, but somehow that seemed like a small price to pay for this moment of accountability. "I'll need your officers' badge numbers and full names," her son continued, his notebook ready. "And I want it noted that every person here witnessed them harassing an elderly woman for gardening while black in her own yard." His voice carried no anger, just a firm determination that justice would be served. The neighbors stayed put, their phones still recording, creating a circle of support around Mrs. Thompson and her son. Some had brought out chairs, settling in to ensure the situation reached a proper resolution. The young college student who mowed her lawn had missed his study group to stay, knowing that some things were more important than biology homework. As the supervisor began taking down details and the officers wrote their reports, Mrs. Thompson reached for her son's hand. He squeezed it gently, remembering all the times she had held his hand through difficult moments in his life. Now it was his turn to hold hers, to be her strength as she had always been his. Sometimes, he thought, Justice arrived wearing a suit instead of a uniform, carried in a briefcase instead of a holster. 3 months after the incident in Mrs. Thompson's garden, her roses were blooming more beautifully than ever. She sat on her porch swing, watching the morning sun paint the petals in shades of pink and red. The garden had become more than just her sanctuary. It was now a symbol of resilience and community strength. The police department had undergone significant changes since that Sunday evening. Mrs. Thompson's son had turned the incident into a catalyst for reform, working with community leaders to implement new training programs. Officers now attended mandatory workshops on community relations, with a special focus on interacting with elderly residents and understanding cultural sensitivity. "Your roses are looking gorgeous today," called out the young mother pushing a stroller past her house. Mrs. Thompson smiled and waved. These days, more neighbors than ever stopped to chat, their presence a quiet reminder of how they had stood together that evening. The incident had transformed her quiet street into a closer-knit community where people looked out for each other with renewed purpose. Her son's law firm had taken on several similar cases since then, but this one held special significance. He had used the recordings and witness statements to create a comprehensive training video for police departments across the state. The video didn't just focus on what went wrong, it showed how communities could work together with law enforcement to prevent such incidents. The young college student who mowed her lawn had written his sociology thesis about the incident, interviewing neighbors and examining how community response could impact police behavior. Mrs. Thompson had helped him with the paper, sharing her perspective over cups of hot tea and homemade cookies. He got an A+, and more importantly, his professor had shared the paper with the city council. Every Wednesday afternoon, Mrs. Thompson now hosted a community garden club in her backyard. What started as a few neighbors wanting to learn about rose cultivation had grown into something much more meaningful. People from all walks of life gathered among her flowers, sharing stories, building connections, and quietly breaking down the barriers that had led to that terrible Sunday evening. The retired nurse next door had organized a neighborhood watch program, but not the kind that sparked fear and suspicion. Instead, it focused on supporting elderly residents, ensuring they had help with yard work and home maintenance. The program had spread to other neighborhoods, creating a network of community care that crossed all demographic lines. Mrs. Thompson's pot roast dinners with her son continued every Sunday, but now they often included neighbors who dropped by to share stories and seek legal advice. Her dining room table, which had witnessed decades of family meals, became a place where community members could discuss their concerns and work together for change. The police supervisor had kept her word about implementing reforms. She regularly attended community meetings, often held in Mrs. Thompson's garden, where residents could voice their concerns in a peaceful setting. The sweet scent of roses had a way of keeping discussions civil, even when addressing difficult topics. Local schools had begun inviting Mrs. Thompson to speak about her experience, but she always turned the conversation toward hope and progress. She shared stories of her teaching days, connecting past struggles with present challenges, helping young people understand that change was possible when communities stood together. Her son had framed the newspaper article about the incident and hung it in his office next to his law degree. But more meaningful to him was the photo of his mother in her garden, taken a week after the incident, showing her back at work among her beloved roses. It reminded him daily why his fight for justice mattered. The young couple who had live-streamed the incident had started a community social media channel highlighting positive interactions between police and residents. They made sure to feature Mrs. Thompson's garden club meetings, showing how spaces of conflict could be transformed into places of connection and understanding. As another Sunday approached, Mrs. Thompson prepared for her weekly dinner with her son. The pot roast would be perfect this time, not overdone like that evening 3 months ago. But she had learned that some things were more valuable than a perfect meal, like the sight of neighbors walking past her garden, waving and calling out greetings, their children stopping to admire the roses that had witnessed both injustice and its remedy. Her garden had become more than just a collection of beautiful flowers. It was now a living testament to how one incident, handled with dignity and determination, could plant the seeds of lasting change. Each bloom reminded her that beauty could grow even in difficult soil, that thorns could protect without threatening, and that the most precious gardens were those tended by an entire community.